With 4.09, we're going to be finding the inverse of a radical function and identifying the appropriate domain for the function. So some of this vocabulary might sound a little confusing. Don't worry, you've probably seen most of this stuff before, and it's going to be pretty easy once you get the hang of it. So let's start with this function. This is a really simple function. It's just y is equal to the square root of x. And what I want to introduce is the concept of finding the inverse. Now the inverse is exactly what it sounds like. So here I have y, and it's written in terms of x, right? Because y is solved for, and x is what I'm doing the operation to. So this is what I like to say is y in terms of x. Now the inverse is going to be the inverse of that, or in other words, another way of thinking of it is the opposite. So this inverse is going to be x in terms of y. So how can we do that? Well, we can solve so that we have x in terms of y. And to do that, what would we need to do? I want you to pause the video and do that for yourself. What would I need to do? Well, I would need, if I start with y equals the square root of x, and I want to get x in terms of y, well, I need to square both sides. And this will allow me to then have x is equal to y squared. So the inverse now, I have x solved for. The inverse of this function is going to be x equals y squared. Okay? Let that settle in for a second, and maybe rewind and rewatch and make sure you understand what is meant by the inverse of a function. Okay, now hopefully that makes sense. Now what we want to talk about is what are the possible values for y. In other words, what is the domain? And you should be familiar with domain. Probably has come up before when you're talking about what are the inputs that a function can have, and that's exactly what it means. So in this function here, the independent variable is y, because that's what I'm doing the operation to. And so the inputs are all the values that y could have. So the domain is going to be all the y values that I could have. So it'd be a good idea, if you don't remember that, to go ahead and define it for yourself, that the domain is all the different values that I could input, or that the input could take on. And I want to talk about what could y be. What are the possible values for y? And in order to think about this, we want to remember that y was equal to the square root of x. So y can't be anything that the square root of x couldn't be. So the square root of x, well, what can the square root of a number be? And what you'll remember is that we always look to the principal root, which is always positive. So the square root of x is always going to be positive, so y always has to be positive. So for my inverse here, I would have to say that y is always positive. Okay? And the way I would say that is that y must be greater than 0, greater than or equal to. Right? Positive is a number that's greater than or equal to 0. It could be 0, of course, because the square root of 0 is 0. Okay? And so this would be the domain of this inverse function. Okay? And the domain is, of course, all the different values that I could input. It wouldn't make sense for me to input a negative number, because a negative number, well, that can't be the square root of something. So I couldn't input a negative number here. Now I want to say just a few more things about why our domain, or the values that y could take on, have to be positive. If we take a look at our original function here, right, what we're doing is we're usually thinking about, okay, if you plug in an x value, what will your y value be? In other words, you plug in some input and you get out an output. The inverse allows us to plug in an output, a y value, and find what the input would have to be. So it's a way of going backwards, right? It's a way of saying, hey, you know a y value, you're trying to find the x value. And so what we're doing is we're saying, okay, what are all the possible outputs that I could have? That's the domain. That's the y's. That's the y values, the inputs. And what are all the different possibilities? Well, if you take a look at the original function, we know the square root of x is always a positive number. So the only types of outputs that I could ever have are going to be positive values. So the domain of this function, or the y values that are acceptable, are only positive values. And the way that I kind of think about that is say, okay, what are all the possible outputs for my original function? Because for the inverse, the outputs, the y values, are now the inputs. It's just switching them, right? The inverse. So it's important to always think about it in that sense. And this will probably make a lot more sense once we do some specific examples. So I'm going to give you one more to try on your own. Make sure you ask a question about it, and then we will discuss more in class. All right, so here we go. Go ahead and pause the video. Try this completely on your own, once completely on your own, and then press play. I'm going to give you just a couple of hints, but I want you for the most part to reason about this on your own and to ask questions or, say, hey, here's what I thought on this. And I really like you guys to respond to each other more so than ask questions on the comments below. So really push yourself to, instead of just asking a question, really try and go and look at other people's thoughts and see if there's a way that you can add something to that. So pause the video, try this on your own, and then press play again. I'm going to talk briefly about them to make sure you understand the problem and in case you got very confused. So I hope that went well. So here I have this equation, c equals 2 plus the square root of x, and you're solving for x. In other words, you're finding the inverse. This is another way of saying find the inverse. In other words, you're trying to get, right now you have x as the input, so you have c in terms of x. And what I want you to do is I want you to find the inverse, or x in terms of c. And then for part B, you want to decide what the domain of the inverse function is. So you have this inverse function, x equals something with c, and you want to say, okay, here are the possible values that my input c could have, because c will now be the input. Okay, so that's a little bit of an explanation. If that helps clear some things up, go ahead and try this again, but we'll discuss a little bit more in class tomorrow.